Let me tell you something that can change the way you see relationships forever. Human behavior is not random. Every action, every withdrawal, every silence is driven by a need, either the need to avoid pain or the need to gain pleasure. Avoidants at their core are not cold. They are not heartless. They are people who learned early on that closeness equals danger and distance equals safety. So when you stop reaching out, something powerful happens. You remove the safety net. You see, avoidants are comfortable when they control the distance. As long as you're chasing, initiating, reassuring, they feel secure without having to risk vulnerability. They get connection without exposure. But the moment you stop reaching out, boom, the rules of the game change. Now the distance is no longer their choice. And that's when panic sets in. Why? Because silence is loud. Silence forces reflection. Silence awakens emotions they've spent a lifetime suppressing. Suddenly, the very space they use to protect themselves becomes a mirror, showing them what they might actually lose. Here's the truth. Most people don't understand. Avoidants fear abandonment just as deeply as anyone else. They've just trained themselves to deny it. They don't run because they don't care. They run because they care too much and don't know how to handle it. When you step back, you're no longer feeding the pattern. You're no longer proving your worth through effort. And in that moment, your absence becomes a message louder than any text or call ever could be. It says, I choose myself. And that is terrifying to someone who believed you'd always be there no matter how little they gave. At a deeper level, this is divine law at work. Energy responds to clarity. When you stop overgiving, when you stop chasing, when you reclaim your power, you realign with truth. And truth disrupts illusions. Avoidants often live in the illusion that relationships can exist without emotional risk. Your withdrawal shatters that illusion. Now they must face the one thing they've been avoiding all along, their own heart. This is not about manipulation. This is about alignment. When you honor your boundaries, you stop enabling dysfunction. You allow consequences to become the teacher. And sometimes the greatest gift you give someone is the experience of missing you. Remember this, people don't value what they don't have to risk losing. When you stop reaching out, you're not punishing them, you're respecting yourself. And self-respect is magnetic. It activates awareness. It creates growth. So stand tall, trust the process. Whether they rise to meet you or fade away, you win because you chose truth over fear, purpose over patterns, and self-worth over survival. That is power. Avoidants rely on distance as a form of emotional control and safety because, for them, space is not emptiness, it is protection. Distance becomes the invisible wall that keeps their nervous system regulated and their fears at bay. At an early stage in life, many avoidant individuals learned a powerful lesson. Closeness equals unpredictability, disappointment, or pain. When emotional needs were unmet, dismissed, or punished, they adapted not by asking for more, but by needing less, or at least convincing themselves they did. Distance became the strategy that allowed them to feel in control of their inner world. Control is the key word here. Emotional control gives avoidance the illusion of stability. When they regulate closeness, they regulate exposure. The less someone knows them, the less power that person has to hurt them. Distance allows them to engage on their own terms when it feels safe and retreat the moment vulnerability threatens their sense of autonomy. This isn't arrogance or indifference, it's self-preservation built on old emotional wiring. Safety for an avoidant does not come from connection. It comes from predictability, and predictability, in their experience, comes from minimizing emotional dependence. When they maintain distance, they feel grounded, composed, and self-sufficient. Their identity is often built around being fine on their own, even if that identity masks unacknowledged loneliness. They confuse emotional independence with emotional security, believing that needing less will protect them from loss. This is why distance feels empowering to them. It creates a buffer between their inner world and external influence. They don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to process overwhelming emotions. They don't have to confront the fear of being seen and potentially rejected. In space, they feel untouchable. In closeness, they feel exposed. What most people misunderstand is that this reliance on distance isn't conscious manipulation. It's an automatic response rooted in the nervous system. Their body associates closeness with threat and distance with relief. So when intimacy increases, Their system activates stress responses, shutting down, pulling away, intellectualizing, or distracting themselves. Distance calms them. It restores their sense of control. However, control always comes at a cost. The same distance that protects them also limits depth. It prevents the full experience of intimacy, trust, and emotional safety that comes from mutual vulnerability. Yet for the avoidant, that trade-off feels worth it, because safety, even if lonely, feels preferable to connection that might wound. Distance also allows avoidants to maintain a sense of superiority or self-reliance. If they don't fully attach, they don't fully risk. If they don't fully invest, they can't fully lose. This belief becomes part of their identity. I don't need anyone. But underneath that statement is often a deeper, quieter fear. What if I do and they leave? By keeping emotional distance, they believe they are preventing pain before it happens. They are managing outcomes rather than trusting connection. This creates a paradox where they crave closeness but only in controlled doses, enough to feel connected, not enough to feel vulnerable. They want relationships without dependency, intimacy without exposure, love without surrender. Distance then becomes their shield and their cage. It keeps them safe from emotional overwhelm, but it also keeps them from experiencing the very connection their heart quietly desires. When you stop reaching out, the avoidant's sense of control is disrupted at a fundamental level. Control for an avoidant is not about dominance over others. It's about regulation of emotional risk. As long as they decide when connection happens and when it pauses, they feel safe. They are the ones choosing distance, timing, and intensity. But the moment you stop initiating, the balance of power shifts, and with it, their internal stability begins to shake. What's unsettling for an avoidant is not the absence itself, but the loss of authorship over that absence. Silence feels very different when it's self-imposed versus when it's chosen by someone else. When they pull away, the distance feels intentional, protective, and calming. When you step back, that same distance feels unpredictable and threatening. Suddenly, the space they once used as armor turns into uncertainty, and uncertainty is the very thing their nervous system struggles to tolerate. Avoidants often believe they are emotionally self-contained, but in reality, they still rely on subtle forms of reassurance. Your consistent presence, texts, check-ins, emotional availability, becomes an unconscious anchor. It confirms that the relationship exists without wreck. You requiring them to engage deeply. When that reassurance disappears, it exposes how much they were depending on something they claim not to need. That realization alone can feel destabilizing. This disruption forces awareness. When you stop reaching out, the avoidant can no longer assume the connection is secure by default. They can no longer retreat, with the certainty that you'll remain exactly where they left you. Their usual pattern, withdraw, regulate, return, no longer guarantees the same outcome. And in that gap, anxiety begins to rise. The mind starts asking questions it usually avoids. Are they still there? Did I go too far? What if I actually lose them? Control gives avoidance a sense of emotional predictability. When you break the pattern, you introduce emotional unpredictability, which activates fear. Their internal narrative of independence begins to crack. They are confronted with the reality that relationships are dynamic and that other people have agency too. This can feel deeply unsettling because it challenges the belief that distance equals safety. What's important to understand is that this disruption is not punishment. It's exposure. You are no longer stabilizing the system for them. You are no longer absorbing the emotional imbalance by overgiving. Without that buffer, they must confront their own attachment patterns. The panic that arises is not about you disappearing. It's about losing the control mechanism they've relied on to avoid emotional risk. This loss of control also stirs vulnerability. When avoidants can't dictate the rhythm of connection, they become aware of their own emotional investment. The feelings they've kept compartmentalized begin to surface, and because they lack practice in sitting with these emotions, the experience can feel overwhelming. Their instinct may be to reassert control by reaching out, testing the connection, or pulling away even further. In essence, your silence disrupts the unspoken contract where you carried the emotional weight. It signals that the relationship can no longer operate on autopilot. For the avoidant, this is both frightening and revealing. It exposes how much of their sense of safety was tied not to true independence, but to predictable access to you. That disruption, uncomfortable as it is the catalyst for awareness. It forces a reckoning with the truth. Control over distance does not equal emotional security. And when that illusion is shaken, panic isn't weakness. It's the nervous system waking up to a reality it can no longer avoid. Silence has a unique power because it removes distraction, and for avoidance, distraction is a primary coping mechanism. When communication stops, there is no external stimulus to focus on, no emotional noise to manage, no relational dynamic to hide behind. Silence strips away the busyness that keeps uncomfortable feelings at a distance. In that stillness, avoidants are left alone with their internal world, and that is precisely what they have spent years learning to avoid. Avoidants suppress emotions not because they lack them, but because they were taught, directly or indirectly, that emotions are unsafe, inconvenient, or overwhelming. Over time, they developed a skill of pushing feelings down, intellectualizing experiences, or staying in their heads rather than their hearts. This suppression becomes automatic. They don't consciously decide not to feel. Their system simply redirects attention away from emotional processing. The moment discomfort arises, when you stop reaching out, that redirection fails. There is no conversation to analyze, no message to respond to later, no relational tension to manage externally. The emotional energy that was once diffused through intermittent contact has nowhere to go. It turns inward. Thoughts begin to surface at unexpected moments. Late at night, during quiet mornings, in the spaces between distractions, feelings they've labeled as handled or irrelevant start asking to be acknowledged. Silence also disrupts their narrative of emotional detachment. Avoidants often tell themselves they are unaffected, that they don't need constant connection, that distance doesn't bother them. But in silence, the body tells a different story. There may be restlessness, anxiety, a sense of emptiness, or an unnameable discomfort. These sensations are emotional signals, and because avoidants are not practiced in sitting with them, the experience can feel confusing and threatening. Without external validation or reassurance, suppressed attachment needs begin to surface. The desire for connection, reassurance, or closeness, needs they've minimized or dismissed, becomes harder to ignore. Silence amplifies what was once background noise. And because avoidants have often judged themselves for having these needs, the resurfacing of emotion can bring shame or internal conflict. They may question why they care, why the absence feels heavier than expected. This internal confrontation is uncomfortable because it bypasses their usual defenses. Emotional suppression works best when there is movement, control, and engagement on their terms. Silence offers none of that. It is neutral, unresponsive, and uncontrollable. It doesn't adjust to their emotional state. It simply exists, and in doing so, it demands presence. In silence, avoidants may begin replaying moments of connection they once dismissed as insignificant. Memories gain emotional weight. What once felt manageable now feels meaningful. This is not because the relationship suddenly changed, but because the emotional avoidance that kept feelings muted is no longer being reinforced. The mind and body begin integrating experience that were previously compartmentalized. What makes this especially challenging is that avoidants often lack the language to process these emotions. They may feel something intensely without knowing how to name it or what to do with it. This can lead to inner agitation, self-criticism, or a strong urge to regain control, either by reestablishing contact or by shutting down even further. Silence, then, acts as an emotional mirror. It reflects back what has been ignored, postponed, or denied. It doesn't create new feelings, it reveals existing ones. And for someone who has built safety around emotional suppression, this revelation can feel like a loss of equilibrium. The discomfort isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that emotions long held beneath the surface are finally being given space to rise. Your absence removes a form of reassurance that the avoidant never consciously acknowledged but deeply relied upon. Even when they appeared detached or independent, your consistent presence functioned as a quiet confirmation that the connection was stable and accessible. It was a background certainty, something they didn't have to think about or tend to emotionally. When that reassurance disappears, it creates a subtle but powerful sense of loss that unsettles their internal balance. Avoidants often believe they are not dependent on others, yet human attachment operates beneath conscious belief. Your availability, your willingness to reach out, to check in, to remain emotionally open, served as proof that the relationship existed without requiring them to fully participate. It allowed them to stay emotionally distant while still feeling connected. This arrangement felt safe because it offered connection without vulnerability. When you step back, that safety net vanishes. The reassurance they lost was not about constant communication. It was about predictability. Predictability. Y equals safety for an avoidant nervous system. Knowing that you would be there, that the relationship would continue regardless of emotional distance, reduced their need to confront uncertainty. Your absence introduces a variable they can't easily manage. It forces them to consider that the connection may not be as guaranteed as they assumed. This loss of reassurance often triggers confusion. They may struggle to understand why your silence affects them so strongly, especially if they've told themselves they don't need much closeness. The discomfort they feel challenges their self-image of emotional self-sufficiency. It reveals a dependency they didn't want to see, not on constant interaction, but on the assurance that someone cared enough to keep showing up without your consistent presence. The avoidant can no longer regulate the relationship from a distance. The emotional equilibrium they relied on begins to wobble. There is no longer an external reminder that things are fine. The absence invites doubt, and doubt opens the door to anxiety. Questions begin to surface. Did I matter more than I thought? Was I taking them for granted? What if they don't come back? This shift can be deeply unsettling because reassurance once came effortlessly. They didn't have to ask for it. They didn't have to expose vulnerability to receive it. Your initiative provided it freely. Now, to regain that reassurance, they would have to do something unfamiliar, initiate, risk rejection, or acknowledge emotional need. That requirement alone can feel threatening to someone who equates need with weakness. The removal of reassurance also exposes an imbalance that previously went unnoticed. The avoidant may begin to recognize how much emotional labor you carried. Your reaching out, your consistency, your willingness to bridge emotional gaps allowed the relationship to function. When that stops, the structure collapses, revealing how much it depended on your effort. This realization can bring guilt, regret, or defensiveness. Importantly, your absence doesn't create insecurity, it reveals it. The reassurance they relied on was masking deeper fears of abandonment and loss. When it's gone, those fears surface. The panic is not about missing communication. It's about confronting the possibility that someone important might choose themselves over maintaining emotional imbalance. In this way, your absence becomes a powerful mirror. It reflects the truth of their emotional reliance, even if they never named it. The discomfort they experience is the nervous system adjusting to a reality where reassurance is no longer automatic. And in that adjustment, they are forced to reckon with the value of what they once assumed would always be there. Avoidants live in a constant internal contradiction. They fear abandonment deeply, yet they are equally afraid of intimacy. These two fears exist simultaneously, pulling them in opposite directions. The fear of abandonment is rooted in early experiences where emotional needs were inconsistently met, dismissed, or withdrawn. Somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness could disappear without warning. Rather than risk that pain again, they developed strategies to stay emotionally guarded. But the fear never vanished. It was simply buried beneath layers of self-protection. At the same time, intimacy threatens the very defenses they built to survive. Emotional closeness requires openness, dependency, and the willingness to be seen. For an avoidant, being seen feels dangerous. It activates old memories of vulnerability leading to disappointment or rejection. So while a part of them longs for connection, another part equates intimacy with loss of control. This creates an internal tug-of-war. Move closer and risk pain, or PU. Pull away and risk loneliness. This dual fear explains much of their confusing behavior. They may crave connection but retreat once it becomes real. They may feel anxious when someone gets too close, yet equally anxious when that person pulls away. The fear of abandonment activates when distance increases, but the fear of intimacy activates when closeness deepens. As a result, avoidants often oscillate, drawing someone in just enough to feel secure, then pushing them away to regain emotional safety. When you stop reaching out, the fear of abandonment moves to the forefront. The protective distance they relied on is no longer voluntary. The absence feels like rejection rather than relief. Their nervous system interprets it as a threat to attachment, activating anxiety and panic. Suddenly, the fear they've been avoiding by maintaining distance becomes unavoidable. The silence feels like proof of the very loss they were trying to prevent all along. Yet even in this panic, the fear of intimacy remains. They may want to reach out, but doing so requires vulnerability. It means admitting they care, that they miss you, that the connection mattered. This creates paralysis. The same defenses that protected them from closeness now prevent them from repairing the distance. They are caught between two fears, unsure which one feels more survivable. This internal conflict is exhausting. Avoidants are often unaware of how much emotional energy it consumes. They may rationalize their behavior, telling themselves they are simply independent or selective. But beneath those explanations is a nervous system constantly scanning for threats, either the threat of being left or the threat of being engulfed. Both feel equally dangerous. The fear of abandonment often manifests subtly. It may appear as irritation, detachment, or indifference, but underneath is a longing to be chosen. When you stop initiating, it challenges their belief that they are immune to loss. It exposes the attachment bond they pretended didn't exist. And because they've spent so long suppressing that fear, its emergence can feel overwhelming. At the same time, the fear of intimacy makes it difficult for them to respond in healthy ways. Instead of expressing vulnerability, they may test the connection indirectly, pull away further, or wait for the other person to bridge the gap. This behavior isn't intentional cruelty. It's the nervous system defaulting to familiar defenses under stress. Ultimately, avoidants are not afraid of love. They are afraid of the pain they associate with it. The moment you stop reaching out brings this truth into sharp focus. It forces them to confront the reality that distance cannot fully protect them from loss, and that intimacy, while frightening, may be the very thing they've been longing for but never learned how to hold safely. When withdrawal occurs, it doesn't just affect the avoidant on a psychological level. It activates their nervous system in a profound way. Avoidants often appear calm, detached, or unaffected on the surface, but beneath that exterior is a system finely tuned to detect relational threat. When you stop reaching out, the sudden shift in relational energy signals danger to their body even if their mind tries to dismiss it. This is where panic begins, not as a conscious emotion, but as a physiological response. Avoidants rely on predictable patterns to keep their nervous system regulated. Consistent distance, limited emotional exposure, and controlled interaction help them maintain a sense of equilibrium. Your presence, even at arm's length, became part of that regulation. When it disappears, the nervous system loses a stabilizing reference point. The body senses that something important has changed, and it responds by activating stress responses designed to regain safety. This activation can show up in subtle but intense ways. Restlessness, racing thoughts, difficulty concentrating, disrupted sleep, or a constant sense of unease may emerge. Because avoidants are not accustomed to linking bodily sensations to emotional triggers, they may misinterpret these signals. They might tell themselves they are just stressed or busy, unaware that their nervous system is reacting to perceived attachment loss. Panic arises because the withdrawal removes their usual coping strategy. Distance works when it's chosen. When it's imposed, it becomes destabilizing. The nervous system shifts from a regulated state into fight or flight or freeze. The body prepares for threat, even if no immediate danger exists. This reaction is rooted in early attachment experiences, where unpredictability or emotional unavailability created heightened sensitivity to relational shifts. Avoidants are often skilled at suppressing emotional awareness, but the nervous system cannot be suppressed indefinitely. When connection is suddenly reduced, the body bypasses cognitive defenses and responds directly. This is why their reaction can feel disproportionate to the situation. It's not about the present moment alone. It's about unresolved patterns being reactivated. The panic is intensified by their lack of tools for self-soothing in relational contexts. Avoidants learn to regulate by withdrawing, distracting, or intellectualizing. When withdrawal no longer brings relief, they are left without familiar ways to calm their system. This can create a sense of helplessness, as the strategy that once kept them safe now fails. In this activated state, the urge to regain control becomes strong. The nervous system seeks to restore predictability and safety as quickly as possible. This may manifest as sudden impulses to reach out, check for reassurance, test whether the connection still exists. Alternatively, it may drive them deeper into shutdown, attempting to numb the activation rather than confront it. Both responses are attempts to regulate overwhelming internal sensations. What's crucial to understand is that this panic is not manipulation or drama. It is the body responding to perceived loss of attachment security. Avoidants may struggle to articulate this experience because it contradicts their self-image of independence. Acknowledging panic would mean acknowledging emotional reliance, something they have spent years avoiding. The nervous system activation also creates urgency. Time feels compressed. Silence feels intolerable. The absence becomes amplified, occupying mental and emotional space. This is why avoidance may suddenly appear conflicted or reactive after a period of distance. The system is seeking relief, not clarity. Your withdrawal, then, acts as a trigger that exposes the limits of avoidance as a regulation strategy. It reveals that emotional detachment does not equal nervous system safety. When the body reacts, it becomes clear that connection was playing a larger role in their emotional stability than they were willing to admit. And in that realization, panic is not weakness. It is the nervous system signaling that something meaningful is at stake. Avoidants are often more affected by loss than they ever allowed themselves to feel connection, and this paradox lies at the heart of their attachment pattern. Because they limit emotional investment as a protective strategy, they rarely experience the full depth of connection while it's happening. Feelings are muted, compartmentalized, or delayed, but loss removes the option to avoid, and in that absence, the emotional weight they postponed arrives all at once. During the relationship, avoidants manage closeness carefully. They downplay significance, rationalize emotions, and keep one foot out the door. This creates the illusion that the connection is lighter, less impactful, or easily replaceable. They convince themselves they are unaffected because they never fully allowed themselves to feel how much the bond mattered. Emotional awareness is deferred, not eliminated, when loss occurs, whether through silence, distance, or the other person stepping back. The emotional accounting begins. The nervous system no longer has the regulating presence of the connection, and the mind can no longer dismiss its importance. Feelings that were held in reserve surface unexpectedly. Sadness, longing, regret, and attachment emerge with an intensity that feels unfamiliar and overwhelming. This delayed emotional response can confuse both the avoidant and those around them. They may appear indifferent during the relationship, but deeply impacted after it changes or ends. This isn't inconsistency, it's timing. Avoidants process emotions retroactively. Safety determines when feelings are allowed to be felt, and paradoxically, loss feels safer than intimacy because it removes the immediate risk of vulnerability. Loss creates a fixed reality. There is no longer a need to manage closeness or fear exposure. The relationship is no longer active, so the threat of being seen or rejected diminishes. In this safer emotional space, feelings finally surface. The pain of loss becomes more tolerable than the anxiety of intimacy ever was. This is why avoidants may grieve deeply after distancing themselves or after the other person withdraws. They may replay moments they once dismissed, now recognizing their emotional significance. Small interactions gain meaning. Missed opportunities for closeness become sources of regret. The mind begins to integrate experiences that were previously kept at arm's length. What they couldn't feel in real time now demon. Attention. The intensity of loss is also amplified by the realization that they contributed to it. Avoidants often avoid accountability during the relationship to protect themselves from shame. But loss strips away that protection. They may become aware of how their emotional distance affected the bond. This awareness can be painful, as it challenges their narrative of self-sufficiency and control. Because they are not practiced in processing grief openly, avoidants may internalize this pain. They may withdraw further, become emotionally numb, or attempt to suppress the feelings again. Alternatively, they may experience sudden urges to reconnect, driven by the desire to relieve the discomfort, rather than a clear understanding of their emotions. Both responses stem from being unprepared for the depth of feeling that loss reveals. The tragedy for many avoidants is that they only realize how much a connection mattered once it is threatened or gone. Their fear of intimacy prevented them from fully experiencing love, but their fear of loss ensures they feel its absence profoundly. This imbalance keeps them stuck in cycles of regret and emotional confusion. Loss becomes the teacher that intimacy never had the chance to be. It forces recognition of emotional attachment, value, and vulnerability. And while this awareness can be painful, it also holds the potential for growth. If the avoidant is willing to face what they feel, rather than retreat from it once again. When you choose self-respect and establish boundaries, you become a mirror. the avoidant cannot easily ignore. Boundaries are not demands or ultimatums, they are expressions of self-worth. For someone accustomed to emotional distance, being tolerated or compensated for by the other person, this shift is deeply confronting. Your grounded withdrawal doesn't accuse or explain, it simply reflects reality back to them. AV. Avoidants often function comfortably in relationships where imbalance exists. When one person overextends, initiates, and adapts, the avoidant can remain emotionally guarded without consequence. This dynamic allows them to maintain distance while still benefiting from connection. The moment you stop overgiving, the structure collapses. Your boundary removes the cushioning that protected them from seeing the impact of their behavior. Self-respect changes the relational energy. It introduces equality where there was accommodation. Instead of chasing clarity or reassurance, you embody it. This forces the avoidant to face a new reality. The relationship no longer exists on autopilot. They can no longer rely on your effort to maintain emotional continuity. The mirror shows them what they contributed and what they withheld. This reflection can trigger discomfort because it bypasses their usual defenses. Avoidants are skilled at intellectualizing, minimizing, or reframing emotions to stay safe. Boundaries don't argue, they don't justify, they simply exist. And in that quiet firmness, the avoidant sees the truth without being able to debate it away. Your self-respect also disrupts the avoidant's internal hierarchy of control. Previously, distance was their power. Now, self-possession becomes yours. This doesn't create competition, it restores balance. But to someone who equated emotional control with safety, this shift can feel destabilizing. They may experience it as loss, even though it's actually the restoration of mutuality. The mirror effect is especially strong because it highlights agency. Avoidants often unconsciously assume others will adapt to them. When you don't, it reveals that they are not the only one with choice. Your boundary says, I value myself enough not to abandon my needs. That statement challenges the belief that relationships can be sustained without emotional reciprocity. This confrontation may stir shame, defensiveness, or self-awareness. Shame arises when they recognize how much they took for granted. Defensiveness may appear as withdrawal or rationalization. Self-awareness emerges when they see the cost of emotional avoidance reflected back through your absence. None of these reactions are caused by you. They are responses to the truth your boundary reveals. Importantly, this mirror does not shame, it clarifies. It shows the avoidant what is required for connection, presence, effort, and vulnerability. Whether they choose to step toward that truth or retreat from it is not within your control. Your role is not to convince or rescue, but to remain aligned with your values by honoring your boundaries. You stop participating in emotional imbalance. You demonstrate that love does not require self-erasure. This is often the most powerful message an avoidant will ever receive, not through words, but through consistency. Your self-respect becomes a living example of what healthy connection demands. In this way, your boundary becomes an invitation. It silently asks whether they are willing to meet you in a space of mutual respect rather than emotional safety through distance. And regardless of their response, the mirror remains clear, steady, and rooted in truth. Thank you for your time, your openness, and your willingness to reflect deeply on these truths. Goodbye for now. May clarity, self-respect, and emotional wisdom guide you forward.